Chapter 40 of Serafina and Twisted Staff. After Mr. Olmsted left the library, Braden looked at Serafina. What are we going to do? First, you need to tell your uncle about what we've learned. I'll go ask my pa to make sure the fire alarm system is working. But before I do that, do you remember the night we were attacked by the horde of rats? We were going in search of Grantham's room. But the rats stopped us, she said. Then the dogs went missing. I don't know where Grantham has gone to, but I'm going to sneak into his room and search it. You be careful, Braden said as he nodded his agreement. He glanced out the window towards the setting sun. When I talk to my uncle, I will also find Renoa. She'll be wondering where we are. Lady Renoa was very brave last night, Serafina said. You go find her. Let's meet on the back Lanagia in half an hour. Got it, Braden said. As she headed up the back stairs to the third floor, she tried to think everything through. It was clear that Uriah had conjured the twisted staff to help him destroy Biltmore and the Vanderbilts. But just as Wasa had said, Uriah didn't fight straight on. He wasn't wielding the staff himself. He had sent in Grantham, his apprentice and spy. When she came to the hallway that led to the Van Dyke room, she paused and took a deep breath. She tried to get into the room multiple times before and failed, but this time she was determined to do it. She crept down the hallway and pressed her ear to the door, listening for movement within. When she didn't hear anything, she slowly turned the doorknob. It was locked. She wished she had Mrs. King's master key ring, but she didn't. She ran down the corridor, slipped into the heating vent, and climbed through the wall. It took her a while to find her way through the shafts, but she finally found a brass register she was looking for and pushed into Mr. Grantham's room. She felt like she was crawling into a dragon's lair, but she found herself in an elegant attired chamber, with goldenrod damask wallpaper, a Portic wood floor, a Persian rug, a small fireplace, and chestnut furniture. The walls were adorned with Van Dyke prints hanging on the wall by long steel wires. It surprised her, but there was nothing obviously wrong or out of the place about the room. I guess there's no dead cat, she thought, remembering Essie's expression. But the room wasn't entirely empty either. A worn shirt and a wrinkled pair of trousers lay draped over one of the chairs. 3 leather suitcases sat on the floor. It made her palms sweat to think about it, but Mr. Grantham could come back at any moment. She searched the room as fast as she could, looking for shoes and clothing stained with pine sap or the black smudge of fire coals. It crossed her mind that she might even find incriminating containers of the highly flammable sap itself. She reckoned the pine forest wasn't just the way for Uriah and Grantham to conceal themselves, but part of their plan to destroy Biltmore. Her pa had told her once that there was nothing hotter than a forest fire burning through a stand of pines, and the trunks of the trees actually exploded when the sap boiled. It would be an ideal way to start a fire inside a house, even one that was designed not to burn. When she didn't find what she was looking for, she opened one of his leather suitcases and rummaged through it. Nothing but clothes. She opened up the next suitcase. Still nothing. After checking the third, she finally stopped. She gazed around the room, frustrated. There's nothing here. For what she could find, Mr. Grantham appeared to be a normal, everyday man. She pursed her lip and breathed through her nose. Perturbed. This doesn't make sense. Where were the fire matches and containers of pine sap? Where were the books filled with pentagrams, runes, and evil spells? Grantham had been so determined to make sure no one entered his room. But what had he been doing? Hiding his stupid toothbrush? There has to be something here. She went back and double-checked the leather suitcases. She searched them more thoroughly this time, looking for unusual seams and details that seemed to be out of place. Then she found it. There was a small hidden compartment in the lining of one of the cases. Now that is interesting. Inside, she found a newspaper clippings, some tattered, going back years, others more recent. But they were all articles about huntings, strange disappearances, and gruesome murders. Many of the names and cities in the articles were underlined. What are you doing, Mr. Grantham? Along with the clippings, she found an old, tattered map of the United States. Each of the locations mentioned in various articles were circled and also marked with what looked like a small X. But then she realized they weren't X's, they were little crosses. And even more disturbing, some of the locations were marked with more than one. Her first thought was that he was obsessed with the following reports of occult and supernatural phenomenon. But then she realized that maybe he wasn't just a follower. Maybe he was the cause of these events. Wherever he goes, people die. Her heart began to pound. She dug through the clippings again, checking the date on each one. The headline of the most recent one read, "The Mysterious Disappearance of Montgomery Thorne." Grantham truly had come to investigate Mr. Thorne's disappearance, but he wasn't a police detective. Why had he come? Besides Mr. Thorne, 3 names were mentioned in the article: the known residents of Biltmore Estate, George, Edith, and Braden Vanderbilt. This isn't good. Most of the circles on the map were worn and faded, but there was one that stood out, the circle that marked the location of the Biltmore Estate. There was no cross beside it. After going to all these other places, he's come here. She gazed around the room, trying to think. The room is so empty, so few clues, but there has to be a way. She stood and she turned. How can I see what can't be seen? She noticed a slight discoloration on the floor in front of one of the upholstered chairs. She got down on her hands and knees and put her nose to the area of the carpet. It's dirt from a shoe. It's a scuff mark. Mr. Grantham sat in this chair. She moved upward and ran her nose slowly along the arm of the chair, sniffing for scents. At first, she couldn't pick up anything other than the fabric itself. Then she caught a faint but extremely distant smell. I've smelled this before. It was the scent of some kind of powdery stone, and she could smell the lingering trace of metal. It seemed so familiar. She could picture it in her mind, but she couldn't think of its name. It was a small, rectangular, smooth gray stone. It's a whetstone. That's what my pa called it. She'd seen her pa use a whetstone in the workshop to scrape a steel blade until its gleaming edges were razor sharp. She swallowed. Grantham sat in his chair and sharpened a bladed weapon. Her chest began to rise and fall more heavily. Her lungs wanted more air. She tried to think it through. Uriah summoned Grantham here, but Grantham isn't just spy. He's an assassin. He isn't just a murder investigator. He's the murderer. She couldn't help but look around the room, but she already searched it. There was no weapon to be found. How does he carry the weapon and conceal it? And more important, who has he come to kill? She remembered that Ezzy and Renoa had told her that Grantham had asked many questions about Mr. Thorne, Gideon, and Braden. One was already dead. One was a dog. There was only one name remaining. When she heard the noise outside the room, she hit the floor and slid under the bed. She waited and listened, her chest rapidly pulling air into her lungs. She heard the muffled sounds. There was some sort of commotion out in the corridor, people talking, a sense of alarm. Her chest filled with panic. She sniffed the air for the smell of smoke, but didn't detect any. She quickly crawled out from underneath the bed and went over to the door. When she heard Essie's voice, she quickly stepped out of the room. "Oh, miss, it's you," Essie said in surprise. "What are you doing here?" "Is there a fire?" Serafina asked. "What's happening?" "We came up looking for you, miss," Essie said. "Me? Why me?" "Someone told Master Braden that you were seen in the gardens badly injured. Master Braden was all a jumbled about where you were, so he went up here looking for you while searched outside." "Injured?" Serafina said in bewilderment. "I'm not injured. Who told him that?" At that moment, Serafina remembered the night she caught the wood rat. Every time it tried to run away, her reflex had been to snatch it up again. When she fell from the grand staircase, her reflex had landed her on her feet. Reflexes were a powerful and useful force, but they could not be used against you. She knew it's because she's done it. A few weeks ago, she had walked the corridors of Biltmore, dressed as a defenseless victim in a fancy red dress. She had used Mr. Thorne's reflex against him and lured him to his dismay. But now, here she was. Someone was in control and it wasn't her. If she was suddenly discovered to be missing and thought to be injured, who was the first person at Biltmore who would react? Who would immediately jump onto his horse and ride blindly out into the darkness of the night, all by himself to save her? She imagined running out of the gardens and finding Braden, lifeless body lying on the ground, ambushed and stabbed to death by a man with a sharpened blade. She grabbed Essie's arms. "I'm going to go out and find Braden and bring him back. But you need to do something very important." Running downstairs as fast as she could and get my pa, Mr. Olsted and Mr. Vanderbilt. I want you to tell them to check the plans of the house and find the place it's most vulnerable to fire. Go to those places and look for pine sap on the floor and walls, or any kind of flammable material. They should station guards to protect those areas. Make sure no one can light a fire." "I'll do it. I'll do it right away," Essie said. Serafina touched Essie one last time and then she ran. She didn't care who saw her or heard her now. She ran frantically through the house and down the stairs, her lungs gasping for air. As she sprinted through the entrance hall, she heard the hooves of Braden's horse clattering across the courtyard in front of the house. She bursted out the front door just in time to see Braden gallop by. He was leaning forward on the horse, filled with panic urgency. She'd never seen him go so fast, but he was riding headlong into darkness towards the gardens. "Braden," she shouted after him, "come back, I'm here, I'm alive." But he didn't hear her. Serafina ran after him. As she went out into the night, she heard a loud, blood-curdling howl of a wolfhound in the nearby trees. A flood of dread poured into her mind. It sounded like the wolfhound, sentinel in the woods, had spotted Braden and was sounding the call for his white-fanged brothers to join him. Then she heard the long, yelping, snapping howl of a single coyote. The howling answered, and the hundreds other coyotes rose up from all around Biltmore's grounds. A terrible thought struck her mind. All this deception and disguise wasn't just about finding the black cloak and burning down Biltmore. Now they wanted Braden. Braden is particular. And soon they would have the boy in their jaws. She heard something in the distance. She knew the racket was too well. The clattering of 4 horses and a carriage on the road to Biltmore. "They are coming, they are all coming." Then she spotted movement ahead at the edge of the garden. She sucked in a breath. The black silhouette of a figure lurked into the shadows, hunched and silking in the long, dark coat. It was Grantham. He was wielding his cane like a weapon. "Braden!" Serafina screamed as he and his horse disappeared into Biltmore's vast gardens. But he was far away to hear her. As Grantham ducked into the gardens behind Braden, he grinded his cane in his 2 hands and drew out a long, pointed, sword-like dagger. There it was. The weapon he had been hiding had finally come forth. The freshly sharpened edge of the blade shone on the moonlight with gleaming power. Brandishing the blade in front of him, Grantham followed Braden down the path into the gardens. He was going to kill him. Serafina bursted forward with new speed. When she finally reached the path, she caught something out of the corner of her eye. A white-faced owl glided low across the courtyard and then disappeared into the garden trees. Her chest tightened with fear. Grantham, the wolfhounds, the coyotes, the stallions, the owl, everything was coming together. The trap had sprung, and she and Braden were the mice. Chapter 41. Serafina raced down the path that Braden and Grantham had taken, but as she rounded the bend, she came upon an unexpected sight. Grantham stood frozen in the path. His back was to her as he stared at the ground in front of him. Whatever it was, it had stopped him dead in his tracks. "Don't move," he said, his voice trembling as he glanced back at her. Serafina didn't understand what was happening until she saw the timber rattlesnake coiled up on the path in front of him. It was a thick, dangerous-looking snake, nearly 5 feet long, brown and patterned with jagged bars. Its nasty wedge-shaped head was rising up off the ground, its yellow eyes staring at him, and its black tongue flickering. She felt so confused. Why had he warned her? Just don't move, Serafina, he said again, as the snake began to rattle. Then Serafina saw that it wasn't just one rattlesnake. There were many of them, lying all over the path and the surrounding grass. One of the lonesome pit vipers coiled mere inches from her bare legs, its head moving back and forth as if it was angling for an attack. Grantham gripped his cane in one hand and his dagger in the other. He tried to step backward, but as soon as his leg moved, the closest rattlesnake struck like the snap of a whip, leaving 2 bleeding holes in his leg so fast that even Serafina barely saw it. Grantham tried to leap back from the terrifying strike, but he landed off the path right onto a second rattlesnake. That rattlesnake lunged forward, its mouth spread, and sank its venomous fangs deep into his calves. As he cried out and tried to jerk away, the third snake struck his thighs. Grantham screamed in pain and tripped backwards, dropping his dagger. The other snakes converged upon him, striking him in the face and throat and chest. Their fangs pumped venom into his bloodstream. Grantham's arms and legs and his entire body were shaking. Serafina had no idea whether she should fight the snakes or run. There was nothing she could do but stand there in horror and watch. Grantham lay flat on the ground now, face up, with his limbs splayed, the snakes draping and coiling around him. A man's face was dark and swollen with poison, but his eyes were open, and he looked at her. She's not who she seems, he gasped in a weak, raspy voice, barely able to speak. What? Serafina asked in confusion. I don't understand. Run, he gasped. Tell me what you're talking about, she cried. She wanted to get closer to the man and hear what he was trying to tell her, but she had to keep her distance from the snakes. She knew she was in danger, but she had to have 2 answers. Who are you, and who are you talking about? She asked him, but Grantham's eyes closed, and he was gone. He died right before her. Serafina stepped back, then stepped back again, aghast with what she saw. She had thought that Grantham was her mortal enemy, the second occupant in the carriage, Uriah's spy and assassin. But she suddenly felt a strange sadness that something had just happened that shouldn't have happened, and that it was all her fault. She looked down at the poor dead man on the ground. Had she made a terrible mistake about him? It seemed like he was trying to help her at the end, like he was trying to tell her something. The silver clasp of the black cloak lay in his open, dead hand. She wanted to grab it, but the snakes coiled around his arm. As horrified as she was by what she'd just seen, and tried to tell herself that what had happened was good, that these snakes had just killed her enemy, it was over. Her enemy was dead. But she shook her head and growled. There weren't rattlesnakes in Biltmore's gardens. Vipers don't hurt in groups and attack people on paths in the shrub garden. They've been brought here by an unnatural power. But he was evil. Grantham should have been controlling these snakes, not getting killed by them. The puzzle wasn't solved. There was just more pieces. At that moment, she heard a tick, tick, ticking sound behind her, followed by a long, raspy hiss. Not a snake like a snake's, but the clicking sound of a barn owl. She felt the hot air of a breath on the back of her neck. I thought I got rid of you, a voice said behind her.